I've been a trucker for over 40 years. I've seen a lot in my time, and I can honestly say there isn't much to shock me anymore. You'd think a job like a trucker, something rather solitary, would prevent someone from seeing some weird shit, huh? But let me tell you, in the dead of night, on lonely roads, this is where the most fucked up things happen. It's not even the rest areas or the truck stops, though some of these I'm convinced are haunted. No. See, it's the road, where there are little to no lights, where the traffic is one car every 20 minutes if you're lucky. Those places are the most dangerous of all. Which reminds me, I have to tell you about that dark zone and Dalton Highway. I'm from Alaska, so obviously the first jobs I took were in Alaska. I was maybe 22 or 23. I'm not too sure of the year when I became a trucker. It means that I was lucky enough to travel the most desolated, isolated portions of the Dalton Highway. It's a stretch between Dead Horse and Fairbanks, and I used to deliver for one of the local groceries with my company. And I've seen my fair share of animals during those years. Can't help it. The stretch of Dalton is one of the most remote roads, surrounded by wilderness. For about 414 miles, you get to drive on a mixture of asphalt or gravel and see nothing but trees, mountains, and animals. Now in winter, it's even worse. But the story I'm about to tell you took place somewhere in June. The weather was warm for the region, and the night sky was peppered with stars. You see, if there's one thing Alaska's got going for them, it's that beautiful blanket of stars at night. You don't see stars like that in New Jersey or New York. It's one of the things I miss the most since I moved from Alaska to New Jersey. That night the sky was cloudless, so I could perfectly see every constellation from behind my steering wheel. You could scold me if you're not paying attention to the road, but I hadn't seen a single car for more than an hour, and any animal is no match for an 18-wheeler. I'd have to get insanely lucky to meet a bear, and even then, I'm pretty sure it would be the Truck 1 Bear Zero. But that being said, I should have paid attention. See, maybe this whole thing could have been avoided if I did pay attention. From the corner of my eye, I noticed something on the side of the road and slowed down my truck. It looked like a human, and it was slowly dragging a big black bag behind him. As I reached him, I lowered my window and asked it if he wanted a lift. I was about halfway through my route, and if I remember correctly, there was still at least 50 miles before the next rest stop. Now the guy didn't answer, just raised a gloved hand and gestured me to be on my way. I told him, "You sure?" And he gestured again. So I muttered a quick "suit yourself" and started driving again, instantly forgetting about him. Now for all I knew, this guy had a shack somewhere in the wild and didn't need help at all. I offered. I did my good deed of the day. And so I didn't think about it for the next hour. Then I saw him again. Now I'd driven far enough from where I last met him that it wouldn't make any sense for me to see that guy again. He was on foot. I was in a truck, for Christ's sake. But it was the same guy, wearing the same black hoodie, carrying the same big bag. Now, I tried not to think much of it. Maybe I was tired and this was a hallucination. I mean, it was close to 2 in the morning, and my last coffee dated back to 7 p.m. I knew there was a rest area a dozen minutes away, but I still lowered my window as I got closer. "You need a ride?" Again, he simply gestured for me to be on my way. I asked him if he was sure one last time. Then I rolled up the window and drove away. I stopped once I reached the rest area, and there I prepared myself a coffee. I washed my face and returned to sit in my trunk to get my dose of caffeine for the rest of the night. I didn't feel fatigued, and I was used to night shifts. It could have just been a hallucination then, or a coincidence perhaps. Two very similar dudes. I mean, no big deal, right? It's a bit creepy though, but you know what it's like on a deserted road in the middle of the night. Nothing ever makes sense. Now I pushed it to the back of the corner of my mind and I turned on the engine. I still had a little under 200 miles to cover, and I wanted to make sure I was done before the crack of dawn, or close to it. Now I expected to be in Dead Horse for 6 a.m. at the latest, but that's only if I managed to keep my speed and stopped looking out for random guys on the side of the road. So I drove out of the rest area, hoped for a calmer rest of the night. But unfortunately, this guy had other plans. About 20 minutes after the rest stop, I met him again. But this time, even before I could reach him and roll down my window, I heard a scream. I heard it as loud and clear as if that screaming woman was sitting right next to me in the cabin. Now it surprised me and I slammed the brake instantly. The noise they made was goddamn awful, and I was on a portion of the highway that was only gravel, so my wheels slipped on gravel for about maybe 10 seconds before I got control of my truck. When I looked back to where the guy was, he wasn't there. And then, another scream tore through the atmosphere, and as I squinted in the general direction of the scream, I noticed him about to enter the forest. There was clearly something struggling inside of that bag, and I felt my heart sink in my chest. Now I'm gonna be honest here. I'm not a hero, but even if I were to call the cops now, I'm at least 150 miles from the nearest town. So cops wouldn't be here for almost a solid 2 hours at least, and that's if they drove very fast. Whoever was in that bag couldn't wait that long, especially after being dragged for so long on the highway. Now at that moment, I didn't even think about how weird it was that this guy kept getting ahead of me, despite being on foot. That screaming woman had stolen my entire focus, and I didn't want to be that guy that didn't try to save her on the news. See, I always have a gun I carry with me for safety. I picked it up, shoved it in my holster, locked it to my hip, and I got out of my truck. I hadn't seen a car since midnight, and I knew I wasn't going to find help for her. I needed to do this, and besides, the edge of the forest wasn't too far. I could probably make it there before he got in. And I lost him. I yelled and screamed after them, but the man acted like he didn't hear a noise. I threatened to shoot as I ran and tried to get closer, but again, he didn't care. When I finally managed to reach close to him, my left knee was stinging. I didn't notice because of the adrenaline, but I tore my jeans and my knees somewhere as I ran. There were many sharp rocks, branches, and various vegetation around, but I could only think about saving that poor woman. Now I held the man at gunpoint and told him in a loud, authoritative voice to stop. He finally stopped. When he turned around, I still couldn't see his face. It was so dark outside, and the shadows under his hood just completely hid his features. It was like I was staring into a void. I could almost see him better when I was in my truck, and the moon kept shining on him. Now that I was closer, it was like he was surrounded by darkness. I glared at him, and then I stared down at the bag. "Hey, what the hell's in that bag?" I asked him, but no answer came. I asked him again, this time with a little bit of anger in my voice. I could see movements in the bag and hear moans. Then the man made the same gesture as when we were on the road, as if asking me to be on my way. I mean, like hell I'd be on my way, when there was possibly another human in danger. I told him I was prepared to shoot him, and that I would be within my rights, that he had 5 seconds to comply. I was putting up a brave front, but damn, the truth is, I was scared shitless. I was in the middle of nowhere with a guy who was, well, I'm pretty sure about to kill somebody and leave her corpse to rot in Alaska's wilderness. You had to be pretty damn dedicated too, to walk so many miles while dragging her, and he didn't even look even a little bit threatened by me, if I could go off his posture at all. His body didn't suggest fear in the least, while I could feel my bones trembling, and my whole body was bursting with anxiety and fear. I was no murderer, but that guy? Hell, clearly that guy was. If all things came to push and shove, of course I would pull the trigger. Why don't you open that bag for me? I ordered him. If he opened the bag and I found a woman, I'd shoot him. Or so I told himself. I'd shoot him, save her, and then I'd call the cops. Damn, did I wish I could have seen his face. You see, he stood there in silence for a few seconds after I ordered him to open that bag, and I could feel my palms getting sweaty. It was a fresh night, too, barely a few degrees above what's acceptable not to be wearing a coat. And I'm sensitive to cold, despite growing up in Alaska. The sweat that covered my back and the weather outside, well, it was not a good mix. I felt wet and cold and fearful, and my shirt was sticking to my skin in a way that just made me want to snarl in disgust. I hate the feeling of wet fabric stuck to my skin. There was a quick movement, and I pointed my gun at the center of the dark hole that was the man's face, or so I presumed. He ignored me and bent down, gloved fingers slowly reaching for the zipper on that huge bag. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I felt just about ready to faint. But I couldn't, because instead of one load, the guy would be carrying 2. I swallowed thickly as he started to unzip the bag. Another scream pierced through the atmosphere, this one so intense my ears were ringing once it ended. The grip of my gun was slippery because of all my palm sweat, but I still managed to keep it pointed at him. I couldn't look down to see if there was a woman in the bag. I was afraid that if my gaze left this man, I would die. He would jump me and it would be all over for little Ricky. Hey, ma'am, get out of the bag now, you're safe. I told her, hoping that she would do her fair share of the hero's work. Once she was out, we would back out slowly toward my truck, which would be the end of it. But instead of a woman, what got out of the bag barely looked human. There was hair, brown and thin, growing in weird patches upon the graying flesh of her skull. Her skin was so thin I could see her veins through her flesh. She had sharp teeth, protruding from both her top and bottom gums. One of her teeth even pierced her cheek, and when she opened her mouth to howl again, I could see the skin around the teeth tear a little bit, black blood leaking from the wound. Now that she was out of the bag, her howl was loud enough to put me to my knees. I had the reflex of putting my hands on my ears, but my eardrums nearly exploded. I heard a dark chuckle rumbling so loudly even the ground trembled. It shook me to my core and made my intestines twist in fear. I could feel that terror coiling around my very organs, suffocating my lungs and squeezing my heart, and I stared up into that woman's eyes, who'd seemed to have grown a meter since her release from the bag. My eyes wandered over her skeletal frame, and I noticed her deflated breasts hanging loosely over her ribcage, half of her bones exposed beneath the gray skin. Don't look into her eyes. His voice was like the wind, carried slowly but steadily, and at this moment, I held up my gun at the creature, and I shot it. She screamed again, and I swear my brain swelled from the noise. My coffee was making its way back up my throat when I heard a few cracking sounds. Another scream that had me writhing in pain, and the final sound of a zipper closing. Now, it took me a few seconds to come back to my senses, but there was blood dripping from my ears, and the ringing just wouldn't stop. I stood up on shaky legs, picked my gun up from the ground, and watched as the man carrying the bag walked toward the edge of the forest. I was still reeling in shock from what I just witnessed, heard, and suffered. My brain was still in pain. There were so many questions I wanted to ask, but I didn't know if I really wanted the answers. At that time I think I sputtered a little, "What the fuck?" and watched as the man gestured me again to be on my way. Now this time he didn't have to tell me twice. I walked back to my truck, turned on the engine, and drove away as fast as I could, not even bothering with cleaning my ears. I thought I would check in at the clinic once I reached town, and I was done with my delivery. I drove the rest of the night in complete anxiety, far too aware of my surroundings. Now, I didn't make it safely to Dead Horse. I delivered my stuff, assigned the sheets, and I headed to the clinic. The doctor said it must have been the altitude that made my ears bleed. Some folks don't handle the mountains well, is what he said. I didn't contradict him. See, I've told this story so many times, but it was the last time I took the night shift on Dalton. 6 months later, I moved to New Jersey. Best decision I ever made.